Hello, welcome to Prism Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 64 of C Sharp tutorial. In this video, we'll discuss about where are indexers used in .NET Framework and what are indexers. In our next video session, we'll discuss about creating indexers. If you're an ASP.NET Web Application developer, then you must be familiar with session state and application state variables. To store or retrieve data from session state or application state variables, we use indexers. Let's understand this with an example. Let's flip to Visual Studio. Here I have an ASP.NET Web Application project and I am on the code behind file of webform1.aspx. Now within the code behind file, in the page load event, let's say I want to store something into session state variable, then I can make use of the session object. And look at this, the moment I open the square bracket, I can see that there are two indexers defined on the session object. The first indexer here is an integral indexer. And then once I press the down arrow, I can see that there is another indexer, and this is a string indexer. The fact that we have two indexers on this session object indicates that it's possible to overload indexers. We'll discuss about overloading indexers in a later video session. Alright, now let's say I want to store something into the session object, and let's say I want to use the string indexer, and let's use the key session1. And then I want to store a string stating session1 data into the session object with that key. Now let's say I want to store another string, and let's call this session2 data, and this time the key is going to be session2. Now here we are using the indexer to actually store the data into the session object. Now is it possible to retrieve data using indexers? Absolutely. Let's see how to retrieve data out of these session keys. So obviously to print something onto the web form, I have to use the response object. So response.write. Now let's print out a hard-coded string saying that session1 data is equal to. Now to retrieve the data out of the session object, look at this, I'm going to use the session object, and then I open the square bracket, and then it shows me again that I have an integral indexer and a string indexer. Now let's actually use the integral indexer to retrieve the data out of the first session key. Okay, so I'm going to say 0 as the index. Okay, so 0 index is going to pull the data that is present in the first session key, session1. And then look at that, the session object actually returns an object data type, because you can store anything into a session state, so it returns an object, but we know that it's a string, so I'm going to convert that to a string. Alright, now let's write an HTML break so that the output comes in a separate line. And then let's say I want to retrieve the data that's present in the session variable with key session2. Now here, to retrieve data from the first session key, we're using an integral indexer. Here, let's say I want to use the string indexer. So I just use the double quotes and then specify our session key, which is session2. And let's change this hard-coded string here to session2 data. Now let me go ahead and run this. As you might expect, we should be able to retrieve data from both the keys session1 and session2. To retrieve data out of session1 key, we are using the integral indexer, and for session2 we are actually using the string indexer. So this is one classical example where indexers are used in .NET Framework. Okay, now if you want to actually see the those indexers within that class, look at this, the session is actually a property within the page object. So right click on the session and go to definition. So this is the session property, and this is actually returning an HTTP session state object. So when we right click on that and then go to definition, within that class you should see two indexers. Now we usually create indexers using this keyword. Look at that, I have two indexers here. The first one is the integral indexer and the second one is the string indexer. Now don't worry about the syntax of the indexers here. We're going to discuss about creating indexers in our next video session. Now if you look at this indexer, look at that, it has got a get and set accessor as well. Just like properties, indexers have get and set accessors. We'll discuss about creating indexers in detail in our next video session. Now So we have just seen the metadata of HTTP session state class showing those two indexers, integral indexer and a string indexer. Now let's look at another example of indexers usage in .NET Framework. Now most of us have written ADO.NET code. Now let's say, for example, here I have this TBL employee table. I want to retrieve data from this table and write that on a web form. Okay, so obviously we need to write some ADO.NET code, and just to speed things up, discussing about the ADO.NET code is out of the scope of this video. We discussed about ADO.NET in a separate video series, ADO.NET video tutorial for beginners. Please watch videos from that series. Okay, but then let me copy this ADO.NET code here, and then let's go to the code behind file of this web form, and let's paste that within the page load event. So let's delete whatever that's there already, and let's paste this. So we are using the configuration manager class to read the connection string from web.config file. So in the web.config file, I have already a connection string with the name DBCS database connection string there. So we are reading that connection string from web.config file using the configuration manager class, and using the connection string we are building our SQL connection object. And look at our SQL command, select star from TBL employee. We are executing the command which is going to return a SQL data reader object. And look at this, we are looping through each row that we retrieve from the database. And look at this, each row will have these columns: employee ID, name, gender, and city. Now let's say I want to print out the employee ID and the name of every employee onto the web form. Then there are two ways that I can retrieve the employee ID column value. Okay, so let's say, for example, response.write. Now the first row will be retrieved into the reader object, so I can use reader. And then look at this, the moment I open the square bracket, I can either use the integral indexer on the reader object to retrieve the column value, or I can use the name. Now let's say, for example, if I say reader of 0, I'm using the integral indexer, meaning I want the first column value. The first column is employee ID, so we will be getting the employee ID. Okay, so reader of 0 dot to string. So that should return employee ID. And just let's hard code a string here saying ID is equal to whatever is the employee ID that we get, and then maybe I want a space, and then let's say we want to print the name as well. So response.write, and let's say name is equal to plus I want to retrieve the name out of the reader object. Again, I can either use the integral indexer or the string indexer. If you are using the string indexer, then you specify the name of the column. Let's say, for example, I want name of the employee, then I say reader of name, that because that's the name of the column, dot to string. And then let's write an HTML break so that every employee record comes in a separate row. Alright, let's go ahead and run this now. As you might expect, we should be able to print employee ID and employee name. Look at that, employee ID is equal to 1, name is equal to Mark. We get that for all the 11 employees. Now again, here we're using the integral indexer and the string indexer. So it's, in .NET Framework there are several classes that already use these indexers. Now in our next video session, we'll discuss about creating indexers for our own class. For example, let's say I have a class called company, which is going to return employees. Now, is it possible to retrieve the company employees using indexers, just like how we are using indexers to retrieve the column values and session values? Absolutely. We'll discuss about that in our next video session. But now, here we have used the SQL data reader, and then we know that it has got two indexes. Let's quickly inspect the metadata of the SQL data reader class to see if it has the two indexers. So we are in SQL data reader class, and then look at that, I have two indexers here again, integral indexer and a string indexer. Alright, so that's the metadata which is showing the indexer. So from the above example, so what are indexes in C#? From both examples that we have seen, it should be very clear that indexers allow instances of classes to be indexed just like arrays. In our next video session, we will discuss about creating indexers. On this slide, you can find resources for ASP.NET C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.